With the major getting closer and closer, we're starting to get some really good scenarios brewing for who gets to qualify. And this last regional only added to the intrigue. So let's go ahead and get right into it. Group A had Gen G, Dignitas, Optic, and Koi. Gen G and Dig were the two teams trending upwards, because Gen G is the best team in the region right now, and Dig was fresh off their first top 4 placement in the tournament, which put them in the thick of the major race. Meanwhile, Optic and Koi were the two teams trending downwards, because Optic failed to make it out of the group stage in the last event, and Koi had lost 12 straight series to start this season, which was tied for the most all time. So one more loss meant that they would have that record all to themselves. And in their first series, they had to play Gen G. And like you probably expected, they lost that series, 3-0. So now, Koi has officially set the record for the most series losses in a row to start a season. So yeah, they've made some pretty unfortunate history there. And in the other round 1 matchup, Dig beat Optic 3-1. So Dig continued their upward trend, while Optic continued to fall. And round 2 was pretty much more of the same for all of the teams involved. Gen G beat Optic 3-1, which most people expected. And then Dignitas beat Koi 3-1, which again, most people expected. So if there are any surprises in store for this group, then they would have to happen in round 3, where we had Gen G face off against Dignitas in the matchup of 2-0 teams, and we had Optic facing off against Koi in the match between the 0-2 teams. We didn't get any surprises in the first matchup, because Gen G defeated Dignitas in a 3-0 sweep. But with this win, Gen G did accomplish something that they hadn't yet this season. They made it through the group stage with 3 wins and 0 losses, and this was the first time all season that they had made it through the first stage of an event without taking a single loss. This might be really surprising considering how good they've been all season, but during the fall split, they never went 3-0 in the Swiss stage, and in the last winter event, they took a loss to Complexity in the group stage. So for the first time all season, they're heading into the playoffs as an undefeated team. So they're still somehow finding ways to raise the bar for themselves. The other match in this round was Optic against Koi, and they gave us easily the tightest series of this entire group. After 4 tight games that were all decided by only 1 goal, each team took 2 of those wins, and we saw this series go into a decisive Game 5. And after Optic scored the first goal of that game, we saw Koi score 3 unanswered goals, including this double tap from Aqua to seal the deal. Koi went on to win this Game 5 and got their first series win of the season. This has been a long time coming because despite not winning a series yet to this point, I really don't think that Koi is that bad of a team. The fact that they're able to consistently qualify says a lot about them, and they had been really close to getting a series win before this, so I'm very happy that their losing streak is finally over. But at the same time, this is a new low for Optic. After a pretty wild transfer window, where they were ready to move on from Magic Bear, but then suddenly had to keep him on the roster, they've now been eliminated in the group stage in 2 straight events, which is something that very few people could have expected out of this team. But you have to imagine that with how eager they were to make a roster move before the split started, that they're going to be even more eager to make one after the split, given how this team is played. But they still have one more event to get through before we get to that point. So the final standings in this group was Gen G first, Dignitas second, Koi third, and Optic last. Group B had Faze, NRG, M80, and Shopify Rebellion. This meant that Faze would get an early chance of revenge against M80, who was the team that knocked them out of the last tournament before the quarterfinals. But before they had that chance, we had to get through the round 1 matches first, with Faze taking on Rebellion and NRG playing M80. And those 2 matches got done pretty quickly because they were both sweeps, with Faze being the victor in one match and M80 being the victor in the other, sweeping NRG out of the series. This had to be really disappointing for the NRG fans, because even though they only made it to the quarterfinals in the last event, gameplay-wise NRG looked really good, so a lot of people were hoping to see them continue that in this event, but this was not the start that those people wanted to see. But for M80, this was a huge victory, because they played really well in the first regional and got some big upsets, but now with this dominant showing against a really good team, they're showing that they're a consistent threat and not just some random upstart team. But for NRG, in round 2 things got even more scary when they lost game 1 of their series against Shopify Rebellion by a score of 5-1. Taking a loss like that after getting swept by M80 made things look pretty dire. But luckily for them, NRG was able to pull off 3 straight wins after that and win this series 3-1. And in the other round 2 series, we had Faze get their chance at revenge against M80, and they took full advantage of it. They swept M80 3-0, and they looked like they had no intention of getting upset this time around. So going into round 3, we had M80 going up against Rebellion, who were looking to avoid going 0-3 in the group stage for the second straight event. They got off to a really good start by winning the first 2 games by a score of 6-0, then 2-0. And a Shopify victory in this series would have put NRG at serious risk of being knocked out in the group stage. Game 3 was really intense and went all the way to overtime, but after Kensei demoed one opponent and bumped the other out of the way to clear the goal for Percy, M80 got the overtime goal, winning Game 3. And from that point on, they took control of the series, winning game 4 2-1 and winning game 5 3-0. So M80 got the reverse sweep and eliminated Rebellion from the event. The other round 3 matchup was Faze against NRG, which gave NRG another chance to get the top level win that they haven't gotten in so long. NRG took game 1 in overtime, and then Faze took game 2 in overtime, both of those games ending with a score of 3-2. Then in the next 2 games of the series, we saw both of them go into overtime again, but Faze got both wins and got the series win in 4 games. NRG played them really closely, taking them to overtime in 4 straight games, but Faze wasn't going to be stopped. They dominated their group by winning 9 total games and only dropping 1. So the final standings in Group B were Faze first, M80 second, NRG third, and Rebellion last. In Group C, we had G2, Version 1, Knights, and Ghost. In the last event, G2 and Version 1 were placed in the same group again, and that time they were the 2 clear favorites to be the top 2 seeds out of that group. And while they were favored to be top 2 again this time, Version 1's spot as the favorite wasn't nearly as secure. Similar to Optic, this team was getting ready to move on from COM to bring in Rise, but after that move fell through, they ended up sticking with COM after all. But then in their first event after that botched transfer move, they failed to make it to the top 8. So in order for there to be any confidence in this roster, they would have to get a good placement here. And at first, it seemed like that wasn't going to happen, because they lost the first 2 games in their series against Knights. But V1 managed to bounce back and win the next 3 games of the series to pull off the reverse sweep. Meanwhile, G2 won their series against Ghost in 4 games, after they lost game 1 1-0, and then outscored Ghost 10-1 over the next 3 games. Round 2 was more comfortable for Version 1, after they only needed 4 games to beat Ghost. And this round was even more comfortable for G2, because they beat Knights 3-0. So in round 3 for this group, we got the standard scenario of 2 teams that are 2-0 facing off, and 2 teams that are 0-2 facing off. The 0-2 matchup saw Knights going against Ghost, and this ended up being a pretty easy victory for Knights. They got a 3-0 sweep, scored exactly 2 goals in each game, and only allowed Ghost to score 1 time in game 3. So this was a really solid victory, and with this result, Ghost was knocked out of the tournament. They were overmatched in just about every series, so there weren't many positives on the field. But one thing that they can be happy about is that just qualifying for this event ensured that they had enough points to qualify for the Winter Invitational too, because if they missed this event, then their crew would have taken their spot. So at least it wasn't all bad for them this time around. In the other round 3 matchup, we had G2 going up against V1, with V1 having a chance to get a really good win and hopefully re-establish themselves in the conversation for the major. But that wasn't going to happen for them this time, because G2 won convincingly. They got the 3-0 sweep over V1, and even though every game was only decided by 1 goal, G2 never really looked like they were ever in any real danger of losing this series. So V1 would have to wait a little bit longer for another chance to get a big win. And the final standings in this group was G2 first, Version 1 second, Knights third, and Ghost fourth. Finally in Group D, we had Complexity, Space Station, Furia, and a crew. It kind of felt like a crew drew the short stick here, because the other 3 teams in this group were really good, and it would be a huge upset if they got a win over any of them. Space Station solidified that in round 1 by beating a crew in a 3-0 sweep. But the other round 1 matchup was Complexity against Furia, which I think was probably the best and most important series of the entire group stage. After finishing second in the Winter Open, Complexity was starting to get some really good results. But after their move from South America, Furia hasn't seen that same success yet, because they haven't been able to make it past the quarterfinals in any event so far this season. But getting a win here against their South American rivals would be a great way to start off this event. And after getting 2 shutout wins in Game 1 and Game 2, it looked like Furia were going to get that good start. But then Complexity fought their way back and got wins in Game 3 and Game 4, bringing us to a decisive Game 5. And in that Game 5, RazeBull pulled out this crazy ceiling reset goal to give Complexity the lead 2-1, and they would go on to hold that lead for the rest of the game. For a team that desperately needs a good placement in the tournament, this might have been the most painful start possible for Furia. But it only got worse from here as they went up against Space Station in round 2 and lost in a 3-0 sweep. This team still hasn't gotten to the form that they found at the end of last season that put them in the conversation as one of the best teams in the world. And now that we're getting so late into this season, they're running out of time to find it. Meanwhile, in the other round 2 matchup, Complexity faced off against the crew, and Complexity got a smooth 3-1 victory, where CRR stole the show by scoring 7 of Complexity's 8 goals in that series. Then in round 3, we saw a crew get one more chance to pull off the series win as they went up against Furia, but a crew fell just short and lost this series 3-1 after a Game 4 overtime. If they had won this series, then they would have finished 3rd in their group, and they would have earned enough points to qualify for the Winter Invitational over Ghost. But unfortunately for them, they weren't able to pull it out. And in the other round 3 matchup, we had Complexity going against Space Station. At this point, Complexity was looking like one of the favorites to make it to the Winter Major. But for Space Station, they failed to make it to the top 4 in the regional event for the first time this season in the Winter Open. So if they wanted to get back into the thick of the major race, getting a win here and going directly into the quarterfinals would be a huge help. But this was the series where we saw that Complexity is on another level right now. They swept Space Station out of the series and didn't let them get the lead a single time in all 3 games. Complexity is looking scarier every time they play a match, and at this rate, they're probably going to be serious contenders at the Winter Major. Or at least they're serious for a team that isn't Gen G or Carmine Corp. Because even with how good Complexity look, they and everybody else are still chasing those 2 teams. But to wrap up Group D, we had Complexity in first, Space Station in second, Furia third, and the Crew last. Going into round 1 of the playoffs, we had these matchups. First, we had M80 going against Furia. M80 was trying to continue their string of really good wins, while Furia was just trying to get back on people's radar. And for a team that had serious major aspirations when they moved from South America to North America, losing this game and missing out on the top 8 would be devastating. But that's exactly what happened, because not only did M80 win this series, they dominated this series. They had really comfortable wins in all 3 games, winning Game 1 4-0, Game 2 5-3, and Game 3 3-0. And probably the most surprising fact about this series is that Yan and Lost were both completely shut out, with neither one of them scoring a single goal in the entire series. All 3 of Furia's goals were scored by Card in Game 2. So now, Furia has some real work to do as they head into the Winter Invitational. As it stands right now, they're pretty far down the standings, so making it to the major is going to be really tough. But for the final winter event, they need to get some wins and establish some kind of positive momentum for their team. In some other tournaments this season, they looked really good in the first stage. Like even in the Winter Open when they won their group and got a victory over Faze Clan. But even with how good they sometimes look in the first stage, they haven't gotten a single win in the playoffs yet this season. And this might have been the roughest showing that we've seen from Furia yet. Getting reverse swept by Complexity and then regular swept by both Space Station and M80 is not a good sign for this team at all, especially considering how one-sided some of those losses they took were. And to make matters even worse for this team, when Lost was brought in, it was expected that he and Yan would combine to make a dynamic duo on offense for this team. But in this event, Card scored as many goals as Yan and Lost combined. And while Card is a really good player, if he's doubling up his teammates on offense, then that's not a good sign for this team. But if there's any good news, is that they still have a few more events and one more split to turn things around. In the next series, we had version 1 going up against Koi, and I was rooting very hard for Koi. Maybe it's because I'm a Detroit Lions fan, but I always like seeing teams who usually struggle turn it around and start getting some wins. But early on in the series, it looked like Koi was going to get shut down quickly. Version 1 won Game 1, that felt weird to say, by a score of 2-1 in overtime. And then they won Game 2 by a score of 7-0. So when Koi went down 3-2 in Game 3, it looked like that was about to be it for them. But they were able to score the next 2 goals in that game, and they walked away with the Game 3 win. Then in a Game 4 overtime, we see Gyro clearing the way for Aqua as he goes on an air dribble, and he takes it the entire length of the field and scores the game-winning goal to bring it to a decisive Game 5. And that Game 5 was all Koi. They won by a score of 4-0 and pulled off the reverse sweep to make it into the top 8 after not having won a single series all season. So you gotta feel really good for these players. But at the same time, you also have to feel kinda bad for version 1. They and Optic were the 2 teams left hanging by the botched transfer for Rise. And now both of these teams are having really disappointing winter splits, with version 1 being 12th in the region during the winter and Optic being 14th. With the major being basically out of reach for both of these teams, it'll be interesting to see how they show up for the Winter Invitational. And it'll be even more interesting to see what happens with these teams after the Winter Invitational, since there might be some roster moves on the way. But we can talk more about that when the time comes. Next, we had Dignitas going up against Knights, in a series between 2 upstart black and yellow teams who were looking to break through into the top tier of North America. After making it to the top 4 in the last event, Dignitas had already put themselves in the conversation for the race to the major, and another top 8 performance here would put them in an even stronger spot. But Knights came into this series ready to play, and they got a thorough victory over Dignitas, winning with a 3-0 sweep, where every game in that series ended with a score of 2-1. Even with a loss here, Dignitas is still in a really good spot for the major, but a win to give them just a little bit more cushion would have been huge. So as it stands now, they'll need to outperform a lot of really good teams in order to hold on to their major spot. They're definitely good enough to do it, but now they'll probably need to pull out a couple more clutch wins to get their spot in San Diego. And the last matchup of this round was Space Station against NRG, 2 teams who we always used to see at the top of North America. But now in this matchup, they're just fighting for a spot in the top 8. NRG swung first, getting wins in Game 1 and Game 2. Then after scoring first in Game 3 and holding a 1-0 lead with 1 minute left, it looked like NRG were going to finish the job. But then Space Station scored 2 goals in the final minute to keep the series going. Then in Game 4, we saw a classic Space Station series, where they scored their first 2 goals by threatening bumps on Garrett G when he was in the 3rd man spot. Then they scored their 3rd goal by actually bumping him. And after that, we saw the series go into a Game 5. And that Game 5 was all Space Station. They scored 23 seconds into the game and held on to the lead for the whole time, taking the Game 5 win and giving us yet another reverse sweep. To this point in the tournament, we had 5 reverse sweeps, 3 of them in the group stage, and 2 of them in round 1 of the playoffs. I don't know if that's a record or anything, but it definitely feels like a lot. But for all the people that were hoping to see NRG back on top, this one had to hurt the most. Because NRG went from looking like they're going to take a very good win over a good Space Station team, to getting knocked out of the tournament before the top 8. And now NRG is also on the outside looking in when it comes to making it to the major. Now heading into the quarterfinals, we had these 4 matchups. And the first one of the day was G2 against Space Station. After G2 easily went through their group and Space Station barely managed to make it here, G2 was a heavy favorite in the series. And they got off to a fast start with a 4-1 victory in Game 1. But Space Station bounced back with their own 3-2 victory in Game 2. But it might be more accurate to say that Daniel bounced back because he scored all 3 goals for Space Station in that game. And the rest of the games in the series looked just like the first 2, with each team trading blows and taking wins from each other, going all the way into a Game 7. So even though Space Station might have had lower expectations heading into this match, they show that they can still compete with the region's best teams. That Game 7 went into an overtime that lasted for over 4 minutes. But we see Space Station get really unlucky at the end, because Daniel tries to jump up to cut off JNAPS' touch, but he gets there a split second too late, and instead ends up hitting it into his own backboard. This serves as a perfect pass to Atomic, and he knocks in the goal, winning the series for G2. Daniel did a lot of work in this series, so for it to end on a play like this has to feel really unlucky for them. Space Station has now failed to make it to the top 4 in both winter events, after going to the top 4 in every event in the fall. They're still right in the thick of the major race, but if they want to be really confident in their chance of making it there, then they'll probably need to make it back to the top 4. And I'm sure a lot of people are hoping that they make it there, because having a player as good as Daniel not qualify for LAN would be really unfortunate for just about everybody. The next match was Faze Clan against Knights, and just about everybody thought that Faze Clan was going to win, which had to be the right assumption to make. But at the same time, there was still a slight risk of an upset, because in the last event, Faze Clan and Knights played each other in the group stage, and Faze Clan won that series, but Knights took them all the way to 5 games. So if Faze wasn't in top form, then there was a slight chance for Knights to take this series off of them. But here, Faze Clan once again confirmed that they weren't going to slip up in this tournament like they did last time, because they beat Knights in a convincing 4-0 sweep, where they looked just as good as everybody expected them to be. Knights are almost on the same level as the other teams looking to break into the top tier of North America, those teams being Dignitas and M80. But the only difference between those teams and Knights is that Knights have yet to pull off the really big win that shows that they can be a threat to the top teams on the right day. But they have gotten really close to getting that type of win. So all things considered, I think this team is right on track with where they should be, and they still probably have a lot of room to grow. The third match featured Koi taking on Complexity. Koi had to feel like they had nothing to lose in this series, because making it to top 8 was already huge for them. Meanwhile, Complexity had a lot more to lose, because while making it to the grand finals in the first event put them in the thick of the major race, they still wouldn't want to drop any points here. Koi got off to a fast start in the series by taking a 2-1 win in overtime after this infield pass from Aqua to Gyro. But Complexity bounced back to take the next 2 wins, before Koi got one more victory in Game 4 to tie the series at 2-2 heading into a pivotal Game 5. But from that point on, Complexity took control of the series and won Game 5 and 6 to win the series 4-2. And while it is always nice to go farther in the tournament, I don't think that anybody on Koi's side was too disappointed after this loss. And the thing that I was happiest about when it came to Koi's performance was that a lot of people got another chance to see just how good Aqua is. Just about everything that went well on offense for this team happened because of Aqua, and that's shown in the fact that he had the second highest goal participation out of anybody in the event, so hopefully he'll get even more chances to shine later on in the season. And the last quarterfinal was Gen G going against M80. M80 have gotten a lot of good wins so far this split, but taking down Gen G would be another thing entirely. M80 was playing them really closely at first, but they weren't quite able to get any wins out of it. Gen G took games 1, 2, and 3 in low-scoring games that were decided by only 1 goal. But after this defensive start, we saw an offensive explosion in Game 4. These two teams combined to only score 5 goals total in the first 3 games, but then in Game 4, they scored 9 goals combined. And in overtime of that game, we see Kinsei clearing the way for Lion Blaze as he gets the overtime goal to give M80 their first win in the series. Then after a dominating 6-2 win for M80 in Game 5, it looked like a reverse sweep might have been on the table. And it got even more stressful for Gen G when that Game 6 also went into an overtime. But after a snipe into the top left corner from Chronic, Gen G got the series win and fought off the attempted reverse sweep. M80 have looked really good so far this split with some of the big wins that they've been able to take, but they still haven't made a top 4 in the winter split. But honestly, I think they're kind of overdue for a semi-final appearance, because they've gotten a lot of big wins, but now they just need to get one of those big wins in the quarterfinals, which I think is very doable for this team, depending on the matchup. And if they get that win in the quarterfinals during the Winter Invitational, then their chances of making the major are going to look very good. Championship Sunday started off with a great match, with G2 going up against Faze for only the 3rd time so far this season, which is kind of a surprise. With the way that these tournaments work, the top teams play against each other pretty often, but these two teams had only faced off twice so far this season, and both of those matches were in the Fall Open, with one being during the Swiss stage and the other one being in the semifinals. So this was an exciting chance to see these two teams face off again. They traded big wins with each other in the first 2 games, with Faze winning Game 1 4-1 and then G2 winning Game 2 4-1. But then after a big victory for both teams, Game 3 was much tighter, going into an overtime that lasted for over 6 minutes. But after Sypical and Mist outplay Chicago and JNaps in the offensive corner, Sypical gets an easy tap-in goal to put Faze up in the series. And this goal that was created by Sypical and Mist really told the story of the entire series. Faze can pretty much always count on First Killer playing extremely well, and that alone is a huge reason why Faze will always be considered a top team no matter who else they have. But when Sypical and Mist are the ones shining on offense, that's how you know Faze is playing really well. And that was the case against G2, because in this series, First Killer scored the fewest goals for FaZe Clan. When First Killer is getting outscored by his 2 teammates, then you're probably going to have a really hard time stopping Faze. And G2 experienced that firsthand because they went on to lose the series in 6 games. But while First Killer wasn't doing the majority of the scoring for Faze, he was still making his presence felt, like he did when he made this crazy pass with 0 seconds left in Game 4, setting the ball up perfectly for Sypical in the middle of the field, who slotted it home to give Faze the game win. There's not really anything you can say negatively about G2 in the series. They played pretty well, but Faze was honestly looking better right now than they had all season, and it was clear that they had their eyes set on the regional title. But to get there, they would need to beat the winner of the other semifinal match, which was Gen G against Complexity. Complexity had Gen G's number earlier in the season, winning the first 3 series that these two teams played against each other, but Gen G reversed that trend in the grand finals of the Winter Open, winning that series 4-1. So after losing the momentum in this matchup, Complexity had a chance to get it back in their favor, with a really important win here. But Gen G continued the momentum from the last matchup between these teams and won the first 2 games by a score of 3-1. So Complexity called a timeout at this point to try to get back on track in the series, but it didn't quite happen for them, because although the margin was closer this time, they still took a 1-0 loss in Game 3. So they only had one more chance to avoid the sweep, and they threw everything they had at Gen G, with Game 4 going into an overtime with the score tied at 4-4. But in that overtime, after Chronic leaves the ball in the middle of his air dribble, he fakes out Raze Bull and gives Nolly a wide open shot that he slots into the bottom right corner under CRR. And after this dominating victory over a really good Complexity team, Gen G officially locked in their place to the Winter Major. You had to figure it was only a matter of time at that point, but locking it in as early as possible has to feel really good regardless. And they also locked in their spot in the grand finals against Faze, which was looking like it was going to be a really good matchup, because while Faze was obviously in top form, by sweeping Complexity, Gen G showed that they were still Gen G, and they were most people's pick to win this series. But Faze struck first by taking a really good victory in Game 1 of the series by a score of 5-2. And in fact, this victory looked so good that Gen G called a timeout after this first game, which doesn't happen very often, but I honestly like the decision to call it there. If you see something that the other team is exploiting that well, then it's probably best to talk it through as quickly as possible instead of waiting until the opponent gets more wins because of it before you decide to talk things through. And after this timeout, Gen G looked a lot better in the next 2 games, because after the 3-goal beatdown they took in Game 1, the next 2 games went into overtime. But Sypical scored the overtime goal in both games, putting Faze up 3-0 in the series, and putting Gen G in a spot where they had to get a reverse sweep in a best of 7 to get the win. But if there's any team in the region who could do it, it would be Gen G, and they got off to a good start on that reverse sweep by winning Game 4 2-1. And then Game 5 looked even better, because Gen G got that victory by a score of 6-0. So if FaZe Clan wanted to avoid a very stressful Game 7, they would need to get the victory here. But in overtime of that game, we see Sypical miss an opportunity to clear the ball into the corner, and the ball bounces out to apparently Jack, who places it under the crossbar and above miss, sending us to Champions Field in the grand finals after a 3-0 start for FaZe Clan. And this Game 7 was really tight. Well, at least it was for a while. The score was still 0-0 with just under 2 minutes left in the game. But after that, Faze go on an absolute offensive barrage, scoring 5 goals in just over a minute, with 3 of those goals being scored by Sypical and the other 2 being scored by Mist. So on the back of this clutch performance by Faze's 2 other stars, they got the 5-0 victory in this decisive Game 7 and got their first regional win since the Fall Open. For the entire winter split, it's been assumed that the 2 real contenders for the major title would either be Gen.G or Carmine Corp. But with this really impressive showing, FaZe Clan have now put themselves into that conversation. In most people's minds, they're probably still a solid third between those other 2 teams, which is absolutely fair. But now we know that on the right day, FaZe Clan is right there on that level. And now their upset loss in Regional 1 seems like a distant memory. But now as we take a look at the standings, we have a really interesting storyline coming up for the Winter Invitational. Gen.G is already clinched for the major, so they don't need to worry about anything. And the other 3 teams in the top 4 are all in a really good spot unless they take huge losses in the Invitational, which I wouldn't bet on happening. But that 5th spot is where things get juicy, because there are 6 different teams who are all within 4 points of each other, and they're all fighting for North America's 5th seed. Out of all the teams that are sitting between 5th and 10th place right now, I really think that M80 has looked the best. But without knowing how the matchups will shake out for that last regional, it's hard to give a solid prediction on who will ultimately take that last spot. But regardless of how it shakes out, I'm really excited for the last event in the winter split. Now, as we get into the best of the rest, let's start in the Middle East, because we're about to run into a really interesting scenario. But I'm gonna be honest, the gameplay on the field wasn't nearly as engaging, because it looked just like every other Middle Eastern regional so far this season. The top 4 teams in the Middle East are Team Falcons, Rule 1, Vision Esports, and Twisted Minds, although Empty and Kohler are pretty close to being in that conversation too. But those top 4 teams were also the same teams that made it to the semifinals. But while this region has a defined top 4, they have an even more defined top 2, because nobody else in this region comes close to Team Falcons or Rule 1. And we saw that play out in the semifinals, with Rule 1 sweeping through Vision Esports and Team Falcons getting a 4-1 win over Twisted Minds. But this series was still kind of a sweep, because the only game that Falcons lost was a game that they had to forfeit because TRK was having internet issues, and they didn't get them fixed in time. But now that we got into the grand finals, this is where things get really interesting. Team Falcons got the regional win in the Winter Open, so if Rule 1 wanted to stay in control of their own destiny for qualifying into the major, they would need to get the win over Falcons here, which would have the 2 teams tied in points going into the final event of the split. But for the second time in a row this split, Falcons got the dominant victory over Rule 1 in the grand finals, and Falcons got their second straight regional win, going 8 points clear of Rule 1 for the race of the major. And for the second straight series against Falcons, Mawson failed to score a single goal in any of the games. Mawson was brought in to give this team the boost they needed to overcome Falcons and make it to the major. And while it's not entirely his fault, this team still hasn't been able to get over that hurdle. And now qualifying for the major is outside of their control. Well, it's almost outside of their control. So Rule 1 and Team Falcons are the 2 top seeds in the region by a long shot. And in the 3rd regional, if they win all the games they're expected to, which I don't think anybody would doubt that happening, then these 2 teams would meet up in the grand finals for the 3rd time in the split. But that would be a problem for Rule 1 because they're 8 points behind Team Falcons. So if Rule 1 wins the regional and Team Falcons gets second, then they'll only close the gap by 4 points, and Falcons will still make the major. So if Rule 1 wins all of their games, then major qualification is out of their control. But with the way that the format is set up, if Rule 1 finished second in their group, then they would be able to set up a match against Team Falcons in the quarterfinals of the tournament, which is a huge difference. Because if Rule 1 went on to win the regional after beating Falcons in the quarterfinals, then instead of only making up 4 points on the gap, they would make up 12 points on the gap, which would be enough to get them into the major. So as crazy as it sounds, if Falcons want to have their major fate in their own hands, then it's in their best interest to finish second in the group. Now I'm not saying that Rule 1 will, or even should lose a match on purpose to make sure they finish second, but it's always a really bad feeling when a team has real incentive to lose a match. And the worst part is that I'm not even sure what they could do to fix this scenario. One potential idea is reseeding how the group stage teams are put into the playoffs for just this tournament, and making it so that it's impossible for Rule 1 and Falcons to meet up before the grand finals. But doing that can also create a lot of issues on its own. So at this point, I guess we'll just have to see how it plays out. Now going to Oceania, this regional got really scary for some of the top teams early on. Pioneers, Power, and Ground Zero Gaming have set themselves apart as the top 3 teams in the region. But in the group stage, only Power got through without issue, because both Pioneers and Ground Zero took a loss in the group stage and finished second in their group. Pioneers lost to Serani, a team featuring Pagsy, Finn, and Tango, and Ground Zero took a loss to the Him Police, featuring Misty, Mach, and Shores. And then Ground Zero almost took another loss in round 1 of the playoffs, which would have been a huge hit to their major chances even though they just won the first regional. But they managed to pull out the Game 5 win over the Spurkies. But going into the quarterfinals, Pioneers finishing second in their group meant that they would be going up against Power again in the quarterfinals, and a rematch of their quarterfinal match from the first regional. Power was just about everybody's favorite to make it to the major out of this region, but that quarterfinal loss they took to Pioneers really set them back. But getting revenge in this series would be a great way for them to make up the ground they lost. And after getting the win in Game 1 and Game 2 of the series, it looked like they were on their way to doing that. But from that point on, Pioneers took control of the series, outscoring Power 11-4 over the next 4 games and winning all 4 of those games to win the series 4-2. And this loss knocks Power out of major contention entirely. And now this team has a lot of work to do if they're going to get back to the top of OCE, where most people feel like this team belongs. And then the other quarterfinal matches went about as expected, with Ground Zero, Serani, and the Him Police all making it to the semifinals. In those semifinals, Pioneers had a pretty tight series against the Him Police, with every game being decided by 1 goal and 3 of the games going into overtime. But Pioneers was still in control most of the way, and they got the series win in 5 games. But Ground Zero had a much tougher time getting through the semifinals, because after going up in the series 3-1, Serani won the next 2 games to bring us to a Game 7. And that Game 7 went all the way to an overtime, but at the end, Super Lucky got a redirect into an undefended net to put Ground Zero in the Grand Finals, setting up a rematch of the last Grand Finals against Pioneers. Super Lucky dominated his old team in the first event, because these 2 teams played twice, once in the group stage and again in the Grand Finals, and Ground Zero won decisively in both of those series. So Pioneers would need to flip the momentum in this matchup if they wanted to get the regional win. And after a 4-0 victory in Game 1, it looked like they were ready to do that. But every time it looked like one team was going to seize control of the series, the other team would fight back and make sure that it stayed really close. And this continued all the way to the end of the series, where we saw ourselves in a decisive Game 7 to determine the regional champ. But in that final game, we saw Ground Zero score 3 goals in the first 2 minutes. And although Pioneers kept fighting until the end, that was a lead that they were never able to overcome. So Ground Zero got the win in Game 7, and they got their 2nd straight regional championship. And with this regional win, Ground Zero's spot at the major is pretty much secure. The only teams left in the running are Ground Zero, Pioneers, and the Him Police. And in order for Ground Zero to lose their spot, they would need to fail to make it out of the group stage, and then the Him Police would need to make up a 16-point gap, which they could only do by winning the regional. So yeah, Ground Zero's pretty much in. And unless the Him Police can make up an 8-point gap on Pioneers, Pioneers are pretty much in the major too. So in a bunch of other regions, we have some wild major scenarios for the 3rd regional, but in comparison, OCE's kinda just chilling. And at this point, the biggest thing to keep an eye on in this region is seeing whether or not Power can bounce back from their slump and start earning more points again. Ground Zero forfeited all of their points from the fall split to form the team that they have now, and it was pretty much assumed that that would take them out of contention for the World Championship. But if Ground Zero keeps playing the way that they are, and Power keeps dropping points the way they are, then it's not really impossible for Power to end up losing their spot at the World Championship. So hopefully for their sake, they're able to turn it around really soon. Alright y'all, like, comment, and subscribe, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, eat your vegetables, and of course, thanks for watching.